good morning. Wonderful to see all of you again today. Last week, I guess as is customary, there was some announcement being made about the new balloons that were going to be at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade this year. This Thanksgiving Day Parade, of course, is not something that we're unfamiliar with. It's been going for almost 100 years. I believe 1924 was the very first year. And each year, in recent years, because it's still this big, bonanza, not just on TV, but also in person and so forth, every year they announce what new balloons are going to be featured in the parade. So this year, for the first time ever, I think there's like a new Ronald McDonald balloon, there's a new Pikachu balloon, and for the first time ever, my personal favorite, Baby Yoda. The reason that these things are such a big deal is because they reflect whatever is going on in pop culture in the country on that given year. Of course, because the parade is something that is so friendly for kids and for families to watch and to go to, every year these companies that advertise, the parade, try to check and see, what is out there this year that kids like or that kids are watching. And they incorporate it, of course, into the parade. But it also means that not just anything goes into the parade. Not just any, cartoon or TV show that's out there or video game gets to have a balloon in the Thanksgiving Day Parade. There's a certain status, if you will, that each year, as long as this Thanksgiving Day Parade has been going, there's a certain level of popularity that must be reached in order for that character, whoever it might be, right? Superman, Mickey Mouse, Snoopy probably as the years have gone on. For that character to be included in this parade, there has to be a certain level of popularity, there has to be a certain level of status, if you will, okay? And it makes sense because they're advertisers and they want to sell things, but not that should take away from the holiday spirit as well. In life, of course, there are many different situations like this, right? We see in our daily life, whether that be in pop culture or otherwise, places where only certain important people or characters or whatever it might be, who fit into a certain category of status can go into. And for the rest, they are not included, right? Now this exists, in a lot of different places in life. And my question this morning to us, brothers and sisters, is are there areas in life where we have not been invited, perhaps, because our status, quote unquote, was not quite to the level that was necessary to be included. Now, whether these situations are real or perceived, of course they exist for us as human beings. Even if it might not be intentional, are there ever times perhaps that we even feel that we are not included perhaps in something because we are not important enough? Or we are not famous enough, or we are not plastered all over the wall enough, shall we say. Or our name is, anyway. Well, in the history of humankind, of course, there have been situations like this many times. And the people of God certainly must have felt like they also were not important enough, or they did not have the level of status to be included in so many other things in their society. We know that in the Roman world, the Hebrew people, like many others, were occupied by the Roman Empire. They were taxed unfairly. We even hear this, even by their own people who were working for the Romans. And for many, many years, they were crying for someone to save them. That is why the literature in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, that pertains to a Messiah is so important. When this Messiah was to come and to liberate the Hebrew people. And it wasn't just the Romans, of course. It was the Babylonians who came and took them into exile, and they were very much second-class citizens, if not slaves, in different points in their history. And so when the people of God were looking at the world, their world today, certainly they were not the ones in charge. They were not the ones who made the rules. They were not the ones who had the status of the Romans. They were an occupied people, and they were underneath that. St. Paul uses the terminology, by the way, in another epistle, the offscouring of all things. The offscouring of all things. I think you get the picture here. Well, St. Paul today describes something that is revolutionary, that is absolutely amazing in the history of the people of God. In his letter to the Hebrews, which was intended specifically to a Jewish audience, perhaps more so than all of his other letters, because he was writing to a Jewish audience, he wrote a little bit more extensively about the traditions of the Hebrew people, specifically in their worship. And today he talks about the place where only the high priest could go, the Holy of Holies. He talks to the people and he says, in this very special place, behind the altar, in this very sacred spot, the Ark of the Covenant was kept. The manna that fell from heaven when the Hebrew people were hungry, the bread literally that fell out of the sky to feed them. Aaron's staff, the rod that budded, he calls it. In other words, that blossomed with almond blossoms. All these miraculous occurrences, these miraculous, very sacred, of the utmost sacredness to the people of God, were kept in this one spot behind the altar. It was called the Holy of Holies. And St. Paul describes it and he says, only the high priest could enter this place, and only once a year, for the atonement of the people. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Jews still have this feast day. It's called Yom Kippur. It's the day that all of people, they believe, are atoned for. We as Christians believe that has already happened in the person of Jesus Christ. But I digress. And so St. Paul describes that one place where only one person could go to. And it is very intentional that this reading is described on this day, because today is the feast of the entrance of the Theotokos into the Holy of Holies. In other words, the church tells us today, despite the fact that only one person, not the rest of humankind, not the rest of us, not you and me, but only the high priest, one person could enter this very sacred space. Only one. Today, the church says something different. The church says that 2,000 years ago, yes, the high priest was going into the Holy of Holies, plus one 3-year-old girl. One 3-year-old girl was brought to the temple by her parents, and the priest brought her into the altar, into the Holy of Holies. That is the entrance we celebrate today, the feast day of the Mother of God. But in other words, what God is saying to humanity is there is no longer going to be a barrier between me and everyone else. The Theotokos comes into the Holy of Holies first, of course. And by extension, this is a message to all humankind. Why is it so significant when Jesus is crucified and is killed that the curtain of the temple is torn in two? It's not something arbitrary just because there was an earthquake and destruction happening at the same time and the graves were being thrown open and all these things. It wasn't just describing the destruction that was taking place. It was very deliberately saying, we're getting really theological here, but just bear with me, okay? It was very deliberately God saying, there is no longer a barrier between me and you. There is no longer just certain people that can come into the Holy of Holies to me. In other words, God is saying, it is all of us now that are able to come into the temple. That is why, again, this is a Hebrew audience, Paul's letter to the Hebrews. That's why we no longer have quote-unquote kosher foods. There's not cleansings that need to happen when someone sins, when they come back to the temple. All the things that are in the Mosaic law, we observe now in the spirit of the Mosaic law, in Jesus Christ. That is why the curtain was torn in two. In other words, God is saying to humanity that all of you are worthy. All of you, all of us, brothers and sisters, are important to God equally in our own way now. Completely radical from what was before. Today, someone else enters into the Holy of Holies. And she represents humanity in so many ways, the Mother of God. And eventually, when Jesus' ministry was fulfilled, the rest of us too entered, if you will. And we encountered and continue to encounter God Himself where we are. That is such a powerful message, because what God is saying is, all of you are important to me. There's no tears in God's eyes for humankind. There's no certain status for those of us who can enter church or not. All of us are important in God's eyes. He says to each of us, in other words, come. There's no longer any need to hesitate. There's no longer any need to second guess ourselves. Who am I? Am I worthy? Am I this or am I that? God Himself sent this message to us in His own person, by the way, because all of us are equally important to Him. Bishop Kallistos Ware writes a little bit about this in the Orthodox way, but he talks about how important all of us are to God. And he poses the question, and he says, if the fall had never happened, in other words, if Adam and Eve had not sinned, and we still lived in perfect harmony in the garden, would God have come to earth? Would God still have come to earth if there was still no sin? Bishop Kallistos examines this, and he talks about what so many of the saints have talked about with this very topic. The answer is yes. St. Isaac the Syrian and others say, we are so important to God, and we are so loved by God, all of us, that He would still have come to earth. He would still have come to each of us to be with us, to welcome us, to say, come to me, to say, come to me, because all of us are important to Him. I just finished a book in the Bible called The Song of Solomon, otherwise known as the Song of Songs, and it's a poem. It is poetry that is written in the Scriptures between a bridegroom and his bride. But the bridegroom represents Christ, and the bride represents each human soul, every soul. And so the bridegroom and the bride are writing these loving messages to one another, very loving messages to one another. And it is God Himself who is speaking to each of us when we hear. For instance, in one verse He says, how fair and pleasant you are, O loved one, delectable maiden. How fair and pleasant you are, O loved one. Each of us is loved. Each of us is important. And the feast that we honor today affirms this. The feast that we celebrate today broke those boundaries. It tore the temple in two. And it says to each of us, by God, it says, come, I love you, and you are important to me, and you matter to me. There is no status in God's eyes. Every soul, all of us, beginning with Panagia, but by extension to all of humankind, is important to God. Let us always remember this, no matter how we feel at any moment in our life, no matter what we encounter in life, no matter what moment we may find ourselves in those feelings of inadequacy, those feelings of being less than important, less than valuable, let us remember what God did to affirm that indeed we are valuable, and we are loved, and we are adequate in His eyes. God bless you. Amen.